Hello learners, welcome to the O-Level Biology lesson with Mr. Tabulo from Orientals College, CBD. From today and the following lessons, we'll be looking on biological molecules and water. Lesson objectives. By the end of today's lesson, you should be able to 1. Define a biological molecule or a biomolecule. 2. To state the 4 main classes of biological molecules. 3. To state the constituent elements of carbohydrates. 4. To state the classes of carbohydrates. 5. To state the uses of mono, di, and polysaccharides. 6. To state the functions of lipids in living organisms. Biological molecules. Biological molecules or biomolecules are chemical compounds that are found in living organisms. Biological molecules, they are the building blocks of life and they perform important functions in living organisms. Classes of biological molecules. There are 4 main classes of biological molecules, which are carbohydrates, proteins, lipids, and nucleic acids. Carbohydrates. Let's start by looking on carbohydrates. Constituent elements of carbohydrates are carbon, oxygen, and hydrogen. These are the 3 chemical elements that make up carbohydrates. Let's look at this typical exam question. The question states that state the constituent elements of carbohydrates, 3 marks. So the answer to this question will be carbon, oxygen, and hydrogen. Classes of carbohydrates. There are literally 3 classes of carbohydrates, which are monosaccharides, disaccharides, and polysaccharides. Monosaccharides. Let's begin by looking on monosaccharides. These are simple sugars. They have a single carbon ring structure. If you see here, this is the hexagonal shape of a glucose molecule, a simplified structure. Examples of monosaccharides are glucose, fructose, and galactose. A common simple sugar, which is glucose, has the chemical formula, which is C6H12 or 6. That is the chemical formula of a glucose molecule. Uses of monosaccharides. Uses of glucose as representing the monosaccharides are as follows. 1. Source of energy when oxidized in respiration. These are used as substrate in respiration. Synthesis of disaccharides. Monosaccharides are used to make disaccharides, such as maltose. Monosaccharides are used to synthesize polysaccharides. For instance, we have glycogen, starch, cellulose. Typical exam question, state the uses of glucose as a monosaccharide in living organism. The uses of glucose, these will be source of energy when oxidized in respiration. 2. Synthesis of disaccharides, such as maltose. Synthesis of polysaccharides, such as glycogen. Let's move on to disaccharides. These are made up of 2 monosaccharides. Di means 2. Sac, which means sweet or sugar. Examples of disaccharides include maltose, sucrose, and lactose. Uses of disaccharides. Uses of sucrose as a disaccharide. Sucrose is the form in which carbohydrates are transported in plants. Sucrose is an intermediate storage molecule in plants. 3. Sucrose can be used as an energy store when broken down to monosaccharides. Uses of disaccharides continuing. 4. Storage in fruits to attract animals for seed dispersal. 5. Used to make nectar, which will attract pollinators, which are insects involved in insect pollination. 6. Converted to starch for storage in plants. A typical example states the functions of sucrose in living organisms. All these uses of sucrose will be answers to this question. Polysaccharides, which means many, these polysaccharides are macromolecules or polymers in carbohydrates. They are made up of monomers, which are monosaccharides. As you can see from the diagram, we have units of monosaccharides joined together to form a chain of a polysaccharides. Here we have glucose molecules joined together to form a molecule which is glycogen, which is a polysaccharide. Let's look at examples of polysaccharides. Examples of polysaccharides. 1, we have glycogen. 2, we have starch. 3, we have cellulose. Uses of polysaccharides. Let's start by looking on the uses of glycogen as a polysaccharide. Glycogen is used as a food store molecule in animals. 2, glycogen is stored in the liver and muscles. Uses of starch. Starch is used as a food storage in plants. Starch is the equivalent of glycogen in plants. Uses of cellulose. Cellulose is used to make cellulose cell wall in plant cells. So cellulose is one of the carbohydrates which has a structural role. 2, cellulose is also used as a food source for some animals, bacteria, and fungi. Lipids. Let's move on to the second class of biological molecules. Lipids, fats, and oils are collectively termed as lipids. Lipids are solid at room temperature, whilst oils are liquid. Lipids are micromolecules which are made up of subunits, which are fatty acids and glycerol. So after the break, we're going to look on the structure of a lipid molecule. Welcome back, learners. Before the break, we were looking on biological molecules, right? We began by looking on the 4 classes of biological molecules, which are carbohydrates, lipids, proteins, and nucleic acids. We defined a biological molecule or a biomolecule, which we said that a biological molecule or a biomolecule is a chemical compound that is found in living organisms. Biological molecules, these are the building blocks of life, and they perform important functions in living organisms. And after that, we looked on carbohydrates as our first class of biological molecules. We said that the carbohydrates, they are made up of these chemical elements: carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. And then we moved on to look on the 3 classes of carbohydrates, which are monosaccharides, disaccharides, and polysaccharides. On monosaccharides, we have looked on glucose as an example of a monosaccharide, and we stated functions of monosaccharides using glucose representing the monosaccharides. And we said that the monosaccharides, their function in living organism, one is they are source of energy. They are used as a respiratory substrate. Two, we also looked at that the monosaccharides, they are used to make disaccharides. Three, we also looked on that monosaccharides, they are used to make polysaccharides such as glycogen. After monosaccharides, we looked on disaccharides. We said that the disaccharides, they are made up of two monosaccharides joined together. Examples of monosaccharides, we looked on maltose as an example of a disaccharide. After disaccharides, we moved on to polysaccharides, and we gave examples of polysaccharides, which are glycogen, starch, and cellulose. We gave uses of each of these polysaccharides. We started by looking on glycogen, and we stated that the function of glycogen is an energy reserve in animals. And we looked on starch, and we stated that starch is the energy reserve which is equivalent to glycogen in plants. After that, we moved on to look on the functions of cellulose as a polysaccharide. We say that cellulose is used to make cellulose wall in plants. After that, we began looking on lipids. Here we are. We say that lipids collectively, they represent fats and oils. Fats, they are solid at room temperature, and oils, they are liquid at room temperature. So fats and oils collectively, they are termed as lipids. Lipids, they are micromolecules which are made up of monosaccharides. These monosaccharides, they make up these lipids, which are micromolecules. Let's look at the subunits which make up lipids. They are fatty acids and glycerol. These are subunits which make up lipid macromolecules. A lipid molecule, which is triglyceride, is made up of 3 fatty acids and a glycerol. Let's look at the structure of a triglyceride, which represents a lipid molecule. This is the structure of a lipid molecule. Here we have a glycerol molecule, which we have a chemical bonds bonding to the fatty acids. These 3 are fatty acids which are bonded to a glycerol molecule to make a lipid molecule, which is a triglyceride. Let's look on chemical elements that make up lipids. Chemical elements that make up lipids are carbon, oxygen, and hydrogen. These are the 3 chemical elements that make up lipids. As you can see that when you look on carbohydrates and lipids, they have the same chemical elements which make them up. The only difference is that in lipids we have more carbon to hydrogen bonds as compared to carbohydrates. Functions of lipids in living organisms. Let's look on functions of lipids in living organisms. Lipids, these are major constituents of the plasma membrane. The plasma membrane of cells. The major elements which make up the plasma membrane are lipids. They are special type of lipids which we term as phospholipids, of which we will look into detail when we move on to A level. These type of lipids, they make up the plasma membranes. Lipids, they are also used as energy reserves. They are stored in animals, they are stored around the abdomen, around organs, under the skin, where they will be used as energy reserves when the carbohydrates, they are depleted. Right? Lipids, they are also energy sources. Lipids can also oxidized in respiration to provide energy. Just like glucose can be oxidized during respiration, lipids can also be oxidized in respiration to provide energy. 3. Now moving on to the point 4. Lipids can also act as insulators against heat loss. Lipids, they are deposited under the skin to form a layer which is called the adipose tissue layer. This white layer, if your skin is bruised, you can actually see a white layer under the skin. That white layer is called the adipose tissue layer, which is a fat layer. The function of that layer is to insulate heat loss. 5. Lipids, they are also deposited around special organs where they function as shock absorbers. These lipids deposited around these special organs, they cushion these organs from mechanical shock, protecting these organs. These are the major functions of lipids in living organisms. Alright, now we have looked on carbohydrates, we have looked on lipids. Let's look at some typical exam questions before we move on to the lesson summaries. Right? First, these are some of the questions that they usually ask you in the exam. 1. List the chemical elements that make up lipids. Did you get that right? 1. It's carbohydrates, oxygen, and hydrogen. These are the 3 chemical elements that make up lipids. Right? Let's move on to the next question. State the functions of lipids in living organisms. Right? Now, let's look on the answer to that. The functions of lipids in living organisms. 1. They act as energy reserves. Where we have fats deposited around the body, they are used as energy reserves. Lipids, they are also used as energy sources. Lipids, they are also used to make up the plasma membrane. Now, let's look on the summary of our lesson as we go to the break. Okay. After the break, we will continue looking on more typical exam questions. But before we go to the break, let's quickly go over the lesson summary. A biological molecule is a chemical compound found in living organisms. 4 main classes of biological molecules are carbohydrates, proteins, lipids, and nucleic acids. Categories of carbohydrates are monosaccharides, disaccharides, and polysaccharides. Carbon, oxygen, and hydrogen are constituent elements which make up carbohydrates and lipids. Carbohydrates are used as energy sources, energy storage, and structural components in living organisms. Lipids are used to make plasma membrane as energy reserves, heat insulators, and shock absorbers of organs in living organisms. Alright, let's take a break. Hello learners, welcome back. Before the break, we were looking on the summary of our proteins and lipids biological molecules. Now, we said that before the break, we were going to continue with the typical exam questions. Right? We have looked on some typical exam questions which come on proteins. Now, let's look on typical exam questions which come on carbohydrates. Right? Let's begin on that. The first question that they usually ask on carbohydrates is that state the chemical elements that make up carbohydrates. Answer to that is carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. These are the 3 chemical elements that make up carbohydrates. Question number 2, state the 4 main classes of biological molecules. These four classes are carbohydrates, lipids, proteins, and nucleic acids. Next question, define a biological molecule. A biological molecule is a chemical compound that is found in living organisms. Next question, state the general functions of biological molecules in living organisms. Did you get that correct? The answer to that is they are building blocks of life. 1. 2. They perform essential functions in living organisms. Those are the two general functions of biological molecules in living organisms. Next question. State 3 main classes of carbohydrates. Answer to that is monosaccharides, disaccharides, and polysaccharides. Give 2 examples of monosaccharides. Answer to that, we have glucose and we have galactose. Give 3 examples of polysaccharides. We have glycogen, we have starch, and cellulose. State the name of a carbohydrate, which is a structural function. State the name of a carbohydrate, which is a structural function. The answer to that is cellulose. State functions of cellulose. State functions of cellulose. 1. Cellulose is used to make up cellulose cell wall in plants. Cellulose can also be used as a food reserve by some microorganisms like bacteria and fungi. Okay, this concludes our lesson on carbohydrates and lipids. Now, let's move on to proteins. Okay, we are now looking on proteins and nucleic acids. Let's begin by looking on the objectives of what we have to cover on proteins and nucleic acid. By the end of this lesson, you should be able to state the constituent elements of proteins, 2, to state the monomers of proteins, 3, to state the functions of proteins in living organisms, to state the subunits of nucleic acids, to state the constituent elements of nucleic acids, and to state the functions of nucleic acids in living organisms. Okay, let's start by looking on proteins. Proteins are macromolecules or polymers which are made up of monomers or subunits which are called amino acids. There are about 20 common amino acids which are used to make proteins in living organisms, of which 11 of these they are essential amino acids and 9 are non-essential amino acids. Essential, which means that animals, they do not process these amino acids. They have to get them from plants. The amino acids are joined together to form a long chain which is called the polypeptide, which form proteins. This polypeptide chain will form 2 different shapes which will give us proteins. Let's look on the diagram. We have different amino acids which are joined together by a chemical bond. This chemical bond is called a peptide bond, which combines amino acids joined to another amino acid to form a long chain, which is called a polypeptide chain. This polypeptide chain will fold to form different proteins. Amino acid, another amino acid, we have a polypeptide chain. Let's look on the chemical constituents of proteins. Proteins are extremely important class of microorganism, of macromolecule in living organisms. More than 50% of the dry mass of most cells is proteins. So the proteins, they make up almost 50% of the dry mass of living organisms. Right? You can actually see why they are extremely important class of microorganisms to these living organisms. Let's look on the chemical constituent of proteins. These are the chemical elements that make up proteins. We have carbon, the chemical symbol C. We have oxygen, chemical symbol O. Hydrogen, chemical symbol H. Nitrogen, the chemical symbol N. Some proteins, they have sulfur, but these four are the common chemical elements found in proteins. Right? Let's look on the functions of proteins. Let's look on the functions of proteins. Right? The functions of proteins include proteins, they're used in the growth of living organisms. Proteins, they are used to repair damaged tissues. When tissues are damaged, the proteins are the ones which are used to replace these worn out tissues, because most of these structures in living organisms, they are made up of proteins. Proteins are used to replace worn out tissues. Some proteins function as hormones in living organisms. Examples, we have insulin and glucagon. Some proteins, they function as enzymes in living organisms, such as amylase and pepsin. Some proteins, they function as constituents of membranes. We'll continue looking on the functions of proteins in the next segment. Thank you.